Hi, everyone. Thank you. Welcome, and thank you for coming tonight. Just for those of you who are online on Zoom, the Zoom session is recording. I'm not sure that the announcement, I think the announcement happened before you all signed on, so just want to let you know. Oh, sorry. Is this better? No. All right, I can be loud.
Hello,
Right.
hello.
Oh,
Yeah, you're gonna
this
have
is
to get
closer.
closer. Better?
All right. How's that? Is that better? All right. Well, welcome. Thanks for coming tonight to hear a project update for the Indian Head River Restoration Project. I do tend to move around, so I will get myself back to the microphone. My name is Becky Malamut. I'm the River Restoration Coordinator with the North and South Rivers Watershed Association. I'm joined tonight by Samantha Woods, who's our Executive Director, Sandra Shah, who is the Project Engineer from Interfluve, Neil Price, who is our Project Engineer from Horsley Witten, and Alex Mansfield, who is the North and South River Watershed Association's watershed ecologist. We also have a couple of members of the steering committee, the Indian Head River Restoration Steering Committee, in the audience. These members were appointed by the towns of Hanover, Hanson, and Pembroke. We have Steve Comito from Hanover, and then Becky Coletta, who just walked in, what great timing, from Pembroke, and Matt Dyer is our representative from Hanson. And then we also have Michelle Craddock in the audience, who is the representative for MassDEP on the steering committee as well. So Sam and I are going to just briefly provide some background and some context before Sandra gets into the real meat of this project update. I wanted to ask you all, both online and in Zoom, to hold your questions until the end. The questions that are submitted via Zoom will be kind of culled and grouped together and read by Alex. So let's get started. So we are here tonight to talk about the potential impacts. Oh, there's Matt Dyer in the back from Hanson. Talk about the potential impacts of removing 2 dams along the Indian Head River. So this is going to come up. Well, we can start it now. So the first dam that we're looking at is the first dam up on the Indian Head River, Luddum's Ford Dam. That dam is on the border of Hanover and Pembroke. And then further upstream, we have the State Street Dam, which is on the border of Hanson and Hanover. Quick poll, people in the room, if you want to raise your hand if you're from Hanover. Okay, great. What about people from Hanson? Great. Pembroke? Excellent. Other South Shore towns? Oh, it's great to see representatives from all towns and all over. And similarly, we have a similar kind of even split online as well. So that's great. So let's see. Let's start with the project objectives. We can take the poll down. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. So the goals of the Indian Head River Restoration Project, or IHRR, to restore native fish habitat, to remove aging infrastructure. You see in this slide, a lot more built infrastructure up at Luddum's Ford Dam than we do down at the State Street Dam. Want to look at reducing liability for dam owners. So in this case, the towns are the owners of these dams. Towns of Hanover and Pembroke are the owners of the Luddum's Ford Dam, and the towns of Hanson and Hanover are the owners of the State Street Dam. We're looking to improve water quality, aquatic habitat, and natural riverine processes, eliminate ongoing maintenance associated with the dam and the fish ladder, and increasing resilience to climate change. These dams were not built to withstand the weather of today and the future. So why dam removal and why now? So this started back in 2016 when the Luddum's Ford Dam had a phase 2 inspection report completed. And the result was that the dam was in poor condition. And so the town of Hanover, and I believe Pembroke as well, started to have conversations about putting money towards repairing the dam. And it was a Hanover resident who said, well, what are we using this dam for? Should we look at repairing it, or should we look at potentially removing it, reconnecting the river, and restoring habitat? So that's when the Watershed Association became involved. Got involved. Let's see here. There we go. Oh. So these 2 dams are 2 of 3,000 dams in Massachusetts. About 50 are currently used for flood control, another 50 for licensed hydropower, and another 100 as reservoirs. Now, these 2 dams that we're talking about, they're not used for flood control. They're not large hydropower dams. They're not drinking water supplies. So they fall into that other group of about 2,800 dams that really serve no purpose anymore. The industries they were built to support no longer exist. And so what we're seeing now are the negative impacts on the rivers and the habitats. So across Massachusetts and across the country and even across the world, organizations and governments are starting to remove dams. So this slide shows MassDEP is the Department of Ecological Restoration. It shows it's their project map. So you can see in purple, those are the completed projects, dams that have been removed. All the red are active projects, and the yellow are culverts. And that's another thing we can do to remove barriers. Thank you, Alex. Remove barriers along the rivers. And the problem with barriers along the rivers when they're not in use, once you lose those industries that they were built to support, as I had mentioned earlier, we have these kind of negative impacts of the dams on rivers. So this is a slide some of you may have seen before at some of our earlier presentations, but just to quickly go through these impacts. So first is, when you put this structure, which is right where the pole is, when you put a pole in the middle of a river, you turn that free-flowing river into a series of disconnected ponds. And that blocks fish passage, so you can see the fish down there. We have our anadromous fish here in the Indian Head River, our river herring and our Atlantic shad that need to go upriver to find suitable spawning habitat that are blocked from doing that by these dams. Then we also have our eels and our brook trout that use the river for passage and can't do that with the dams. You also, these ponds behind the dams are impoundments. They just are bodies of water that sit there. So the water temperature increases. That has all sorts of impacts on water quality, both lessening of oxygen and increasing of algae, and it makes it a really difficult place for those animals and plants to live. And then finally, you can see that yellow bar on the left there traps, the dams can trap sediment behind that structure, which covers up the riverbed that can be used as habitat, and it also can increase levels of concentrations of contaminants in the water body itself. And then the other reason we're looking to remove these dams and now is because we have funding. We have funding through this phase of the project through MassDEP's Natural Resource Damages Fund. And this fund was put together to restore habitat that was impacted by contamination upstream at the fireworks site. This money can't go toward cleaning up the fireworks site. It can't go towards dam repair. It can only go toward habitat restoration. So I mentioned the fireworks site, just address the elephant that is in the room, at least for some of us, which is the potential designation of that site as a Superfund site. So what we know is that whether or not that area is designated, makes it onto the NPL list or designated as a Superfund site, that's not really going to affect the mechanics of these dam removal projects. What you're going to hear Sandra present in terms of how the dams will be removed, what they'll look like after, none of that will change as a result of the Superfund, potential Superfund designation. What will change and what will be impacted is a timeline as we try to understand if the potentially responsible parties upstream are deemed responsible for the contamination that we're finding behind, contaminated sediment behind Luddum's Ford Dam, which Sandra will speak to quite a bit. So I just want to close my section by kind of reminding everybody we're here to talk about these two project sites here. We're talking about the potential impacts of removing Luddum's Ford Dam and the State Street Dam. We're not here to talk about the factory pond site. We're not here to talk about potential Superfund designation. We're not here to assign blame to anybody upstream. We're here to hear the data that will be presented by the consulting team and then make a decision with you, the dam owners, on what you want to do with these sites. What do you see next? What do you see as the vision? Is it dam removal and river restoration? And we'll have three different options that Sandra will present, and we'll discuss a little bit more at the end. I'm going to turn over to Sam now to talk a little bit about the Watershed Association's perspective.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Becky, I'm just gonna, unless you can't hear me. Can you hear me in this thing? Yeah? I'm pretty loud anyways. You're not loud enough?
Sam, the camera's also facing the top.
Oh, okay. I'll get up. I think Sandra's not going to.
I'll get up.
Okay, all right. Hi, everybody. My name is Samantha Woods. I'm the Executive Director for the North and South Rivers Watershed Association. First, let me thank you all for coming out tonight. It got cold, so I was wondering if people would show up or they were going to stay at home to keep warm. I just have a few remarks to say before we get into the meat of the update of the presentation. And You know, it's what the North and South Rivers Watershed Association is supportive of. And we are supportive of the dam removals that restore rivers whenever feasible, because we believe the best thing for the river is to let it be a river and to allow it to adapt into the future and to support all the wildlife that rivers support. Rivers are one of the most endangered habitats on the planet because of the damming of them and the alteration that we have made. And those free-flowing rivers support a lot of variety of species that many of which their populations are, if not endangered, certainly diminished. So we're faced with a unique opportunity here to restore the Indian Head River, allowing its upper reaches to reconnect to the North River and Massachusetts Bay, and restoring habitat for fisheries that have been impacted for over 300 years from these dams. 300 years ago, the public, nor the river, was ever asked if damming it was the right thing. Industry, private, and privatization of the public's natural resources were done without the benefit of public input. We have a unique chance to revisit that decision. We have a unique opportunity to revisit this decision that was made without the public's input. And we have a chance to redefine our relationship with the river and nature to coexist and allow it to flourish. And uniquely, we have funding to restore fisheries habitat. So I hope today that you'll listen to the presentation, ask some questions after it's done, because many of the questions that you may have, I hope will be answered through the presentation itself. And then think about how you can best support nature and what you want to pass on to the next generation. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Okay, awesome. So let me share my screen. Okay. All right. Thanks for coming here today. My name is Sandra Shaw. I'm an engineer with Interfluve, and today I will be talking to you about the Luddum's Ford and State Street Cross Street Dam Removals Restoration Feasibility Project. So we are here today because we have two dams that no longer serve a purpose. Along with preventing fish passage, they disrupt the natural temperature, sediment, and flow cycles of the river. They also pose a safety risk and liability for the towns. So in this presentation, I'll be talking to you about the feasibility of removing these dams, first discussing the work completed by the team, then discussing the findings of the study with the help of Neil from Horsley Witten, and then I'll give two case studies of completed dam removal projects. So our team shown here, the consultants include Interfluve, Horsley Witten, the Herring Pond Tribe, and PAL, the Public Archaeology Lab. Our team is hoping to provide you with a vision of what removing these two dams could look like. Over the length of the project, we met with the steering committee, including the towns of Hanover, Pembroke, and Hanson, the North and South Rivers Watershed Association, and MassDEP's Natural Resources Damages Program, to discuss important design elements and weigh the costs and benefits of these dam removals to show you, the owners of the dam, the potential for restoration at these sites. So here's a map showing the dams in the larger context of the watershed. The Indian Head River, it might be hard for you to see, but it's labeled and you can see the dams, meets the Herring Brook to form the North River. And then the fish, the migratory fish that is a major focus of this restoration, they hang out in the Massachusetts Bay most of their lives. They're able to swim upstream up the North River all the way into Indian Head River until they reach the Luddum's Ford Dam. Some make it up the fishway, but most don't. And if they do make it up the fishway, they get stuck at the State Street Cross Street Dam. There's no way for fish to pass at that dam, even though it's about 4 to 5 feet tall. And I also want to make a note that both of these dams have had many names over the years. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'll just be using the name shown here. And then I'll also say that this black arrow here is showing the direction of flow, and you'll see that on future slides. So before I get into talking about the dam removal, I'd like to introduce you to each dam we're talking about today. So like Becky said, Luddum's Ford is owned by the towns of Hanover and Pembroke. Just to explain kind of what a dam is, a lot of people think that it's just the spillway, just that concrete piece, but it actually includes a lot of other elements. It has abutments on either side. It includes the embankment, which is the earthen fill on either side of the dam. For Luddum's Ford, there's a fishway and a stilling basin, which dissipates the energy of the flow. And then there's an impoundment, which is the water that's behind the dam. Luddum's Ford Dam is about 12 feet high. It's an intermediate sized dam with a low hazard classification. It's a run-of-river dam, meaning that there's no flood control benefit and there's constant flow over the spillway. And like Becky called upon the report from 2016, the dam was found to be in poor condition, and there's uncontrolled seepage from underneath the primary spillway, and there's cracks throughout the concrete. There are also signs of erosion on either side of the embankments. And the report also noted that the spillway capacity is unknown. These inspection reports happen every 10 years, so the next one would be happening in 2026. So here's State Street Cross Street Dam. The dam was breached in 1973. It was originally 7 to 8 feet tall, and now it's about, like I said, 4 to 5 feet tall. It was also a run-of-river dam. And like I mentioned before, there's no way for fish to pass this dam here. So here we are in the dam removal process, very early stage. We're in the feasibility study. And all of the following steps below feasibility study need to happen before the dam is actually taken out. So right now, we're looking at we're evaluating the feasibility of the dam removals with the goals of improving fish passage and habitat, reducing flood risk, eliminating dam owner liability, and maintaining and enhancing recreational access and opportunities. And part of the feasibility that we'll be talking about is about reviewing existing conditions, looking at the feasibility of removal, determining the costs, the benefits, the impacts of removal, and developing concept plans to give you all an idea of what removal could actually look like. So now I'm going to go into the assessment and investigations we worked on. We looked at the history and cultural resources at the dams and the surrounding area. We looked at the hydrology and hydraulics of the river in existing conditions and with the dam removed. And we looked at the sediment characteristics and management strategies. So understanding the history helps us understand the current state of the dams and surrounding area, and informs us of anything else we need to be aware of as we design removal. So in partnership with the tribes, we learned how meaningful this section of river is. Migratory fish runs were staples to the Native American subsistence way of life and still play a major role in the culture. And in the 1980s and 1990s, archaeologists from nearby university discovered Native American artifacts on either side of Luddum's Ford Dam, both on the Pembroke and Hanover side. And these findings give further evidence that this was a site where Native Americans congregated. Starting in the late 17th century, European settlers began harnessing the river for a whole range of manufacturing industries. So the river saw a sawmill, grist mill, carding mill, tack and nail factory, ironworks forge, and a rubber plant. So based on these cultural assessments, both sites are characterized as having high sensitivity for pre-contact Native American cultural deposits and post-contact industrial archaeological resources. The archaeologists we worked with from Powell did note, though, that the dam removals will have no effect on historic architectural resources provided measures are taken to protect the Elm Street Bridge. The long history of industrial land use for manufacturing has implications for the sediment quality, as we know, and the research that went into that history helped inform our sediment sampling plan and analysis, which Neil will elaborate on later. So here we have the model results to look at the impacts of the dam removal on flooding. This is showing, on the top, it's showing existing conditions, and the bottom map is showing proposed conditions for 3 different storm events. So the 2, the 10, and the 100-year flood events. So the 2-year event means that there's a 50% chance of that flood occurring in any given year, whereas the 100-year event has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. So it's much more rare to see a 100-year event, but it has a 1% chance of happening. So the overall takeaway here is that the dam removals will not worsen flooding downstream. The dam removal will reduce flooding around the Luddum's Ford Dam, and the dam removal eliminates the risk of flooding due to dam failure. This is a bit more of, it's actually looking at the profile view of what you just saw. So I'm going to explain it to you. It's a little overwhelming maybe, but it's not. So your y-axis is elevation, and the x-axis is the channel distance. You have Elm Street Bridge and Luddum's Ford Dam, your existing stream bed and your proposed stream bed. So basically what this is showing is that when you remove the dam and you get rid of that existing stream bed, basically cutting out that wedge of sediment, you drop flood profiles. So the green is existing and the blue is proposed. And so you see the biggest drop in flood profiles around the dam, and then there's less of a decrease as you move upstream. Feel free to ask me questions about that later. So here we have the State Street, Cross Street flooded mapping. So we don't see as big of a difference in between existing and proposed for the flood extents, but you do see that the flood extents do decrease when the dam is removed. And that's because the dam isn't as big as Luddum's Ford. But similar to Luddum's Ford, this dam will not worsen any flood conditions downstream, and the dam will reduce flooding under high flow events. And then here we have the same profile for State Street, Cross Street Dam. Like I said before, there's not as big of a difference between the flood profiles, but you do see a decrease. I also want to note that we looked at the velocities during the migration season to make sure that fish can pass upstream successfully. And we also looked at velocities during big flood events to ensure that removing the dams don't pose any risks to infrastructure nearby. So here's a map of the sediment depths at Luddum's Ford. So basically, we went in a canoe and we probed until we hit the bottom of the sediment, and we noted the depth that we reached, and we created a map. So the deeper sediment depths are in the orange and red colors, whereas the more shallow sediment is the kind of blues and purples. And we do this because it gives insight into where the pre-dam channel might be, and it helps us know where water might want to flow once the dam is removed. So we often locate our proposed channel in the location of where we think the former channel might be. This kind of map also is important to estimate sediment quantities behind the impoundment. And we didn't create a similar map for State Street because we found that it was mostly coarse sediment behind State Street, suggesting that most of the fine sediment was evacuated downstream when the breach occurred. And now I'm going to hand it over to Neil to talk about the sediment sampling.
Thanks, Sandra. Good evening, everyone. Pleasure to talk to you tonight about the sediment portion of this project. For every dam removal project, sediment is one of the driving factors that we need to look at carefully. Perhaps the most, frequently one of the most important ones for what the cost of the actual removal may be. So like all of those, we looked at this carefully here. We developed a sampling plan for both impoundments based partly on what we call a due diligence review. And what a due diligence review is essentially a review of the historical records of what might have gone on here in the past to give us a clue of what kind of things, what kind of contaminants might have been contributed into the river as a result of those past activities. So we actually use a for pay service. You give the money and they give you back a report that has a whole bunch of aerial photos, historic aerial photos, historic maps. Very significantly, these things called sandborne fire insurance maps, which existed for many years going back into the 19th century, that companies had to pay for. So it tells you what kind of building was on different lots, so we could see what sort of manufacturing facilities were present there. Based on that, we of course knew that there was a lot of manufacturing. There was a railroad bed that ran across Luddum's Ford, which has its own set of contaminants associated with it. So based on that, we developed a set of parameters that we wanted to sample for. So these parameters are what are called up there, the MassDEP 401 Water Quality Certification Regulations. That's a mouthful, but what that means is those are the regulations that govern how sediment can be managed in Massachusetts. So we had to follow those. There's a set of specific parameters you have to sample for to meet those requirements. And then we also added a bunch of additional parameters based on this due diligence review targeting the industrial uses of the land. We then had a conversation with MassDEP, who ultimately will have all the say on how sediment can be managed here, to discuss what we propose doing, got their input on what they would like to have done, and resulted in a final sediment plan that described what we were going to sample for in terms of parameters, and in how many places. So as a result of that, we collected 21 total cores and submitted those as 7 composite samples. So every 3 cores went into one sample. So you take 3 cores in different places, mix them together, that becomes a single lab sample that you send to the lab for analysis. And that was done at 7 locations. So downstream of Luddum's Ford, in the Luddum's impoundment at 3 different locations. So 3 times 3, 9 different cores in the Luddum's impoundment. And then at State Street, where we had 3 times 3 or 9 again. Here's a map of the State Street sampling with the results shown. So the colors, as I mentioned, we were doing this compositing. So you see there are 3 green dots, 3 purple, 3 orange. So each of those colors were the individual spots that were sampled and then composited together into one laboratory sample. So by doing this, we got an assessment of what the sediment quality was like immediately upstream of the dam in the center of the channel, on the banks immediately upstream of the dam, and then a little further upstream. So the results for the key things are shown here. So we have lead and mercury shown because these were the 2 metals that exceeded the regulatory thresholds that we have to look for. Not in every circumstance, but in some circumstances. All the other things that we sampled for came up as non-detect or below all of the regulatory standards. So lead and mercury are what we're going to talk about here, both at this site and at Luddum's Ford. And so these results are shown, and S1 stands for Soil Standard 1. That's the MassDEP's regulations for soil. And there's 3 criteria, or 3 groups of that, S1, S2, S3. S1 is the most stringent of the three possible. So S1 is in play when people have a chance to come in contact with the with said soil. I also should point out that these standards I'm talking about, these MassDEP S1 standards, are for soil. Soil, by definition, is dry matter above the mean high water line. This stuff that we sampled is sediment, so it's wet muck below the mean high water line. So from a strict regulatory definition, these standards don't apply to the material in the river that we sampled, but it's the only regulatory threshold to look at, and it's useful to get a feel for what the overall quality of the sediment is like. So that's why we do this. So you can see that upstream, we are below the standards for, in the green and purple dots, for both lead and mercury. And then on the banks, we have some spots where lead slightly exceeds the standard. So what this is telling us, that this is really pretty good news here for this site, that the majority of this sample, a majority of the sediment in this impoundment above State Street is suitable for passive release downstream. In particular, all of it in the area in the center of the impoundment that's likely to be mobilized. So the stuff on the edges is likely to stay put post-dam removal anyway, and as part of the design, if necessary, it can be stabilized so it won't move at all. So this, we have very low concern about this site with sediment quality. There's greater concern downstream at the Luddum's Ford Dam. So here we are downstream at Luddum's Ford. In this case, we have the blue are our three downstream spots. And then we have another reddish orange color immediately above the dam, purple in the middle of the channel, a little further above the dam, and then green on the river left side, closer to the former rubber plant. So this was picked again to give us a feel for the areas, the downstream of where the sediment would likely go to. So we want to compare what's in the impoundment versus where it might go to see how similar those, the giving versus the receiving areas are. And the green dots that have, by the way, we'll talk about in a second, have the highest concentrations of these metals is closest to the former rubber plants. So we were thinking that might be a place where there might be higher concentrations, and indeed there were. So what these results are showing us is that we have lead at about double the S1 standard, mercury also at about double the S1 standards for that river left green dot area. A little more in the center and in the area more likely to move, the results are a little bit better. We have lead again above the standard, but mercury is below it. And then downstream, we have lead above the standard and mercury below it. And that's an interesting comparison point. So if we look at the upstream purple orange versus the downstream blue, the lead numbers are very similar. So what that's saying is that if this sediment were to be allowed to move downstream passively on its own post-dam removal, the receiving waters have about the same concentrations already as what's upstream. So that reduces the concern about doing that. Mercury is a little different, so that's needs to be thought about some more. And of course, that river left area is a little higher. So we'll talk a little bit about potential alternatives for managing the sediment next. Before we get to that, though, we'll just give a little bit more of a summary. So we have 4 of the 7 samples that went to the laboratory had either lead or mercury that exceeded those MassDEP S1 standards, generally somewhere between 1 to 2 times those standards. So not horribly over, not by orders of magnitude, but over. And then there's another set of standards I haven't talked about yet that are called ecological screening values. And those are, instead of being based on human health, those are based on ecological health to the environment, and those concentrations are lower. And all of our samples exceeded those screening level values for the ecological thresholds. As I mentioned, the concentrations of lead in both impoundments are similar to the downstream concentrations, and the highest concentrations above both dams are along the riverbanks. And again, that's critical because post-dam removal, the riverbank areas are the least likely to have that sediment move downstream as opposed to the stuff in the center of the channel. And a lot of people want to talk about the factory pond contaminant site. So it's just for perspective that we have our concentrations of mercury are between 1/3 to half less of what was found upstream in factory pond, and between 50 and 95% less for lead. So the concentrations of these two metals are significantly lower for these two impoundments as compared to the actual contaminant site, the regulated contaminant site upstream at factory pond. And lastly, before anything happens, a bunch more sampling will need to be done to inform all of the potential management options and how this might proceed going forward. So what are the management alternatives? They're listed here. The ones in blue are what, in our opinion, are the more likely possibilities. Excuse me? No. The ones in blue are what, our opinion, are the more likely possibilities that will happen, and the ones in black are the less likely. So starting from the easiest is passive downstream release of all the sediment. So that's obviously the cheapest. There's no digging it out, there's no moving it. Probably unlikely to happen because we do have some exceedances. Then we have partial removal. It's where you would target, and again, this is where the more sampling comes in. You would do more sampling to target where the highest areas of high metals are and try to remove those. And also try to remove the areas that to create your channel so that you're, instead of letting nature and chance dictate which sediments will migrate post-dam removal, you create it. You define where the channel is going to be, and you remove those sediments so that you're targeting those areas. And the sediments that you remove can be either put on site, stored on site, capped with clean sediment, or they can be shipped off site. And what's important here is that in the state of Massachusetts, landfills won't accept soil that exceeds those S1 standards. So we would have to make sure that whatever portion was going to a Massachusetts landfill was below those standards. Anything above it that were to go off site would have to get shipped to an out-of-state landfill at very high cost. So if that volume is high, it drives the cost of the dam removal to a very high level. And I turn it back to Sandra to take us from here. And I'm sure you'll have questions on this, but we'll get to the questions at the end.
Okay, so these are our paths forward for these dams. I'll go over the pros and cons of each one, but I need to back up. Okay. So for the State Street Cross Street Dam, there's really no other options other than leaving the dam in place or removing the dam and restoring the river. Whereas for Luddum's Ford, there's repairing the dam, there's a possibility of a dam failure, and there's and then there's completely rebuilding the dam, and then there's removing the dam and restoring the river. So I'm going to focus on kind of those options, those four options in the next few slides. So here's dam repair. I like to think of dam repair as a temporary solution to address immediate issues or risks, but not necessarily the best long-term solution. Like I said, it's a quick fix. It keeps kind of flat water recreation, but other than that, there's not many pros. I guess if you like the aesthetics and you like to canoe and things on the river and fish on the pond and fish on the pond, there's that as well. I put the sediment management kind of in the middle. You're delaying it, but it's still an issue. Fine sediment will continue to accumulate behind the dam, and it will become more and more of a problem. The cons, there are still major improvements needed on the dam, or needed for the Luddum's Ford Dam. You still will have annual maintenance costs. The safety concerns will remain. The legal and liability concerns will remain for the towns. And the dam will continue to alter the Indian Head River ecosystem and historic fish runs that are important to the tribes, and a lot of community members will still be blocked. We did some cost estimates to look at the cost of the dam repair over 50 years, and it came to about $800,000, including inflation over 50 years. And then there's dam failure. So, repairing the dam and that kind of Band-Aid fix could still lead to a dam failure, and especially if those dam repairs don't happen in a timely manner. So we know that that Luddum's Ford has uncontrolled leakage, and advanced decay of concrete. And if the Luddum's Ford Dam did fail, there would be an uncontrolled release of sediment, and there would also be a disturbance to sensitive archaeological materials. The cost for this is unknown, and it would depend on the damage caused, but we're seeing these types of things happen more and more with aging infrastructure, failing with large rain events, and increased flooding. So this would be kind of worst case scenario. And then there's the dam rebuild option. Pros would be that you would be rebuilding the dam correctly to today's standards, and you'd be reducing a lot of those safety concerns. The cons would be the towns would still own the dams and still have that kind of legal and liability issue. There still would be annual maintenance. The dams would continue to alter the Indian Head River ecosystem, and the historic fish runs would still be blocked. And this would be a really expensive option. Concrete's really expensive, and we estimated that to be around $4.7 million. And that's money that, that funding isn't dedicated towards yet. There's that would come from, towns or state or federal money. So, and then we have the dam removal and river restoration option. So again, sediment management's kind of in that pro-con middle category. It's not, it's a complicated thing to address, but it's been done, and it is an impact of having these dams in place for so long. Pros, you're improving aquatic organism passage and habitat, removing safety concerns, removing legal and liability concerns for the towns, improving water quality, promoting recreation supported by uninterrupted river. When I was out surveying, I saw a bunch of kayakers put in downstream of State Street Dam. And I asked what they do when they get to Luddum's Ford, and they said they had a portage. So this would be a good thing for them. And then you're also restoring natural hydrologic and sediment regimes. And the cost for restoration, we estimated there's a pretty big range. So we kind of did the low end and then the high end. So it'd be $2 to $5.6 million, depending on those sediment management decisions and future sediment sampling. So with future sediment sampling, we would be able to find kind of hotspots of contamination that would really cut those kind of costs down. And that's typical of a lot of dam removal projects in Massachusetts. And so Horsley Witten came up with these conceptual renderings to look at before and after pictures of each site. So here we have Luddum's Ford Dam on the Pembroke side looking upstream, and here it is restored. The dam is now removed. There's a nice riffle, which means like rock that's sized to be stable in the location of the dam, and all this beautiful native plant and wildlife thriving. It's great, right?
Where's the unicorn?
And so part of the Luddum's Ford Dam removal and restoration, part of the actual construction that we would propose is protecting those sensitive areas, putting matting down and fencing down for the excavators and trucks, removing the dam spillway and the right abutment. The left abutment we would have to detach from the foundation remnants of the old industry buildings. we would excavate the sediment to construct the channel, establish a riffle at the site of the dam, which I explained before what a riffle is. And then we would install large wood in the banks to provide for additional fish habitat and stabilization of those banks. And then we would also use fabric covered slope and plantings to stabilize those banks as well. And here is kind of like a plan view image of the planting plan and some, I know it's hard to see, but there's different zones for planting. And the tribe, helped, add some culturally significant plants to this list as well. So there's, a wetland zone, a transitional zone, and an upland zone. And then here we have State Street Cross Street Dam. This is upstream on the Hanover side, looking down at the road. And this is existing conditions. And then here we have proposed conditions. So, removing the dam would expose some more of those banks, and we would, vegetate those and stabilize those banks. And part of the State Street Cross Street Dam removal construction would involve protecting those sensitive areas, removing the vertical extent of the dam spillway and the right and left abutments, removing selected stones to grade the channel that allows for fish passage, and then adding scour protection measures at the bridge, and then similarly stabilizing the banks with fabric covered slope and plantings. And here is kind of that overview map of State Street Cross Street. There's less of an area that's impacted, so it'd be a much smaller project than Luddum's Ford. And so now I'm going to talk about two case studies. The first one is on the Mill River in Taunton, Mass. The Mill River is used to be severely dammed and is no longer. So this work started in 2007, and we still have monitoring going on today. And there's a lot of similarities to our project. The dams were owned by different entities. The impounded sediment had varying levels of contamination. And there were also elements of the project that had historical value. There's nearby bridges that had to be evaluated for stability, and there were a lot of construction logistics because of the urban environment. So we're focusing on the Hopewell Mills Dam, which is this one downstream here, the State Hospital Dam. And on the left, you have the impoundment pre-dam removal, and on the right, you have the impoundment or the river post-dam removal. And so in the impoundment, there were 14,000 cubic yards of sediment. Metal concentrations were similar to what we have in Luddum's Ford. And in addition to metals, they also had polyaromatic hydrocarbons. And for this project, they reused most of the excavated material on site. And based on the sediment sampling and many phases of the project, they were able to pinpoint a hot spot of lead, and they only had to remove 12 cubic yards of lead to an offsite facility. And the rest of the sediment they were able to reuse on site. Here's a picture of during construction. You kind of see those fabric covered slopes to provide stability on the banks, and this is showing kind of like active removal. There's some large wood in there that's put into the banks for fish habitat and stability. And then here is the river post removal, 5 years after construction. And then this is the first migratory season after removal. They saw a ton of fish come upstream, which was really exciting. The second case study is the Shawsheen River in Andover, Mass. And we're going to be looking at Marlin Place Dam, which is kind of the second downstream dam. The river is flowing from the Red Cloth Dam to the Balmoral Dam. And here is the Marlin Place Dam, highly urbanized, in between two buildings with a road upstream. And they found lead that exceeded the human they also found lead that exceeded human health thresholds, and was actually higher than what we are seeing in the Luddum's Ford Dam. And here is the dam, or the river post-removal. The dam was removed in 2017, and I think this is in 2022. And so here they had to remove all the sediment off-site. And there was around 3,000 cubic yards of sediment removed to an off-site landfill. Here is the dam upstream looking downstream. Here is it during construction. And here it is in 2019. And that's it. Thank you for listening and coming today.
Okay, so I am just going to wrap this up by hopefully sharing my screen again. Bear with me here. All right, let me get off my tippy toes back here. So thank you, Sandra. That was incredibly informative. It's a lot of information. So I put together a couple slides to kind of help us organize our thoughts a little bit before we move into the questions and answers. So the first thing we're looking at here is what do we know versus what we don't know. There's a lot we now know as a result of this feasibility study, but it's also uncovered a lot that we don't know. So what do we know? We know that dam removal is possible at these two sites. We know that dam removal at these two sites is not going to increase downstream flooding. We know that it will increase suitable habitat for fish, birds, and other riverine species. Previous dam removals. We'll do questions when we wrap this up if you want to hold on to that one. We know that removing State Street Dam will be easier and less complicated than removing the Luddum's Ford Dam. We know that recreation is going to change, especially behind Luddum's Ford Dam, and go from fishing in a flat pond environment to fishing in moving water. Paddleboarding, canoeing, kayaking will now be available throughout this entire stretch of river. The trails, which we know are important to a lot of people in this area alongside the river, are not going to change and will still be very much available. And we also know that funding, again, is available for habitat restoration. What we don't know is, again, how Superfund is going to impact this project. We don't know how long these dams will be able to withstand current and future climate conditions. As we saw in Sandra's presentation, State Street already has those two areas of breach. We don't know exactly how much sediment will need to be removed, and that's a huge piece in the cost of these projects, or of the removal project. And we also don't know the source of the contaminated sediment behind these dams. So I put together a little matrix to look at Sandra's the three options that we have. Come on. There we go. So we have our three options. We have dam repair, we have dam rebuild, and then we have dam removal and restoration. So I included those project objectives we talked about at the beginning of the session. I also included funding being available, because that's a really big piece of this, right? Who is going to pay for these projects, whichever project it is? Is it going to be the owners or the towns? Or will there be funding available? Will it be state? Will it be federal? So currently, there really is only funding available for the dam removal and restoration, as far as we can tell. The dam rebuild will check the boxes of removing aging infrastructure, as well as reducing some liability for dam owners, as well as increasing resilience to climate change, none of which will be to the extent of the dam removal and restoration. And the dam repair really doesn't check any of the boxes of the project objectives. So what do we do now? What are our next steps? So I'm going to try to go to the next slide. All right. So the next step is the towns are going to need to make a decision about whether or not they want to pursue restoration at these sites. Kind of taking sediment off the table because there's so much unknown around that. Do the towns and do the dam owners want to pursue that as an option? Is that what you see as a vision and as a future for these sites? If the answer is yes, the Watershed Association can then go and try to get more funding to do that additional sediment sampling behind Luddum's Ford and get some additional consultation to understand what the costs really will be. And kind of wait for the EPA and the Superfund designation to happen and see where that data brings us. From there, we'll move into a 75% design, then to permitting and fundraising, and then to construction. All of these steps will allow for multiple options for public input, public hearings, that sort of thing. So again, we're at this decision point here. I'll be going before the select boards of all 3 towns, hopefully in early 2024. I'm trying to schedule those now. And what can you do if this is something you support? Share it with your select board members. Let them know. Look for those meetings because we're going to be asking for the towns to make a commitment, and it'll have to be a written commitment so that we can then move forward to get funding to take the next steps for the project. So again, the question here is, do the towns, the dam owners, support removing these dams and pursuing restoration as a vision for this site? Okay, so now we're going to move on to questions. Wait, can I, 1 second? Okay, so we're going to take some questions. I'll take a couple from the audience. We'll do a couple from the Zoom. Alex has been calling the questions in the Zoom and grouping them together based on common themes. We do ask that you keep your questions, your comments to 2 minutes. We do ask that you listen to see if your question might have already been addressed as Alex pulls them together. It might not be exactly what you asked, but it might be quite similar. And now, yes, Jocelyn.
I think it might be helpful for folks that aren't familiar with the watershed to understand why you and Sam are sort of driving this conversation for the towns or proposing this to the towns. Maybe a little color commentary on why, what you guys are and what's behind you proposing this.
Yeah, do you want to do that?
So the North and South Rivers Watershed Association's mission is to protect our waters, and restoring our rivers is part of that work. We do that through citizen engagement, advocacy, and our role in this has been to provide a vehicle for getting the funding to be able to answer some of the questions that are needed to be answered to understand how we could restore this river back to some health and restore some of the species that have been harmed through the creation of this dam. So I hope that provides you a little bit. We've done this before in a few other dams, and we have, I think, 3-4 other dams on the projects that we're working on throughout the watershed. There's, you saw there was 3,000 dams in the state of Massachusetts. We're, in our watershed, we have around 60, a little bit more than 60 dams that we know of. So they're prolific. They're everywhere. And unfortunately kind of just left behind legacies of this past industrialization that we had in our area. Okay. Becky, as a steering committee member, I'm going to ask you to.
Well, so I've been on the steering committee for the last year or so. I forgot when we started, whether it was a year and a half. When I joined the steering committee, I was a member of the Pembroke Select Board, joined the committee because I had seen some dam removals and I was interested, but I didn't have very strong feelings about whether it should be removed or not. I've sort of passed by that dam, looks pretty, and I've enjoyed walking around the dam. I see people fishing there. Why mess with it? I needed to be convinced. I will say that when you start to look at dam restorations, there's a reason why there's money available for dam removal and not for dam rebuilding. You're rebuilding a dam that creates damage to the environment. When you look at the impoundment behind the dam and you start to listen to these guys more and more, you hear about the ways in which the impoundment keeps the water warmer and kills more fish and has more kind of, I want to say, not dead zones, but it's not as full of life. I also learned that this is the first dam that you hit coming off of the bay. And so if you come up the river and if you're trying to get from here to the bay, or you're trying to get from the bay inland, Luddum's Ford is the first dam you hit. So when fish are trying to migrate inland and they're trying to migrate for spawning, they hit a roadblock here. So when you hear 3,000 dams, it starts to sound overwhelming, like what's one or two dams? But it's an important dam because of where it is. And the fact that the fish can't make it up the ladder and they can't make it past the State Street Dam became very important to me. So I've become, after listening to these guys and looking at the data over the last year, I've become much more supportive of dam removal. And, maybe somebody can talk to, why is there money only for removal and nobody's really putting money into dam building at this point?
So the federal government in particular, and National Marine Fisheries Service, is often a funder of these projects because of the concern out at sea for river herring. River herring populations have really declined. And so by allowing them to have more access to more habitat, then they can have more babies and have more juvenile fish, more population increase. But that's not the only fish that benefits from this. There's a lot of river fish, if you will, brook trout, for instance. In the Third Herring Brook, where we've removed 3 dams, we now have brook trout in the main stem, and we were able to utilize that actually to designate it as a cold water fishery, which gave it additional protections, particularly when the mall was being built from them. They were required, because we found brook trout in the main stem, they were then required to treat their stormwater to a higher standard. Because they couldn't just let their stormwater flow off of the parking lots into the river anymore. They needed to treat it more highly. So there are other fish besides the herring that would benefit from us being able to have free-flowing rivers. But largely, it's the federal government that is concerned about these habitats, and National Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries Service. They're the ones that have been able to come with the bigger dollars. Now, they come at the end. They don't come at the beginning. They want to know that the owners are committed to the project. But once we get through that part, if the towns are interested, then we've been able to procure funding for the removals of dams. One we just found out about on the South River at Veterans Park, we were just awarded $1 million for. So there is larger dollars out there that you can leverage. And in this particular case, you have the Natural Resources Damages Trust Fund, which was set aside from the damages that we are seeing from the upstream factory pond, not to clean up that, but for offsite damages. So because we aren't able to eat the fish because of the mercury, there was funding put aside, and there's about almost $7 million that can only be really used for fisheries habitat restoration. So you have this pot of money, which is like gold for us, to be able to say we could go in and do something here. So you're in a unique position because you already have a little bit of money to start this process with, quite a bit of money. We'd like to see that money multiplied as much as possible, not just here, not just using it on this particular dam or the 2 dams that we're talking about. We are doing a study right now looking at all of the different culverts in the Indian Head River watershed to see if there are other habitat restoration projects that we can bring those monies to bear on. There's no guarantees that this money will be here forever. So we really want you to think about it now, because this is the opportunity to take advantage of it. So, very rare for us to have money to do good for the environment.
All right, so that was 2 from the audience. Let's take 2. Are you ready to do 2 online?
Sure.
Great.
I don't know if this lets people hear. We did have a request from the Zoom to repeat the questions because they can't hear the audience. So this is sort of 2 related questions. I think we have someone wrote in asking if portions of the river are on our property in Hanson, about 100 feet of waterfront.
Talk louder, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Is this microphone working or not? Not working? Okay.
If you push it, does it work?
I did. Is that working?
Here, why don't, yeah.
How do we do this? We have a Zoom question that says, if portions of the river are on our property in Hanson with about 100 feet of waterfront and the river is about 40 feet across, do we have any say in how it affects our property? And I think this may be the same person wrote, will the width of the river change before the State Street Dam? So Sandra, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, so yeah, we've worked with landowners before where the river falls on their property to kind of discuss the restoration and also work with them to make sure that they're happy and they're getting what they want. And so, you know, sometimes that comes into play in terms of planting certain, you know, types of vegetation in the riparian area by the river, or creating a path, or, you know, it comes in multiple different forms. But yes, we've worked with landowners for sure and involve them in the process early on. Yes. And then in terms of State Street, because the dam is only 4 to 5 feet tall, you're not going to see much of a decrease in the width of the river. Really, it would really just be around the dam itself, but it wouldn't really extend upstream.
We also had a question maybe for Neil about why were the samples composited, which would reduce your data.
Yeah, it's a good question, and the short answer is money. And the slightly longer answer is that's the normal way to do it. So the point of compositing is to, especially at this stage in the process, which is like initial feasibility evaluation, is to get a general idea of what the contaminant portfolio is like in different areas and try to categorize them. So we grouped them into places that had significance. So downstream of Luddum's Ford, immediately upstream of each dam, so places with generally similar characteristics, so that we could get an idea of what those characteristics for specific areas were like. And then later you would do more targeted sampling, and especially like the suite, we talked about mercury and lead for results. We sampled for over hundreds of parameters. Each sample costs something close to $2,000 in laboratory fees to send in. So with the future targeting, if we're only going to sample for mercury and lead, those sampling costs, those lab costs, come way down into, you know, under $100 per sample to just look at those specific compounds. So once you get the broad idea of what things are like, then you can target in later for lower cost and more detail.
Here, maybe we can give the mic to the people. So the Zoom people can hear you.
Thank you. Look at you, look at them. Two questions. One, with the change in elevation and now having a riffle instead of a dam, will the Indian Head River, which is tidal below the dam, be tidal above the riffle after it's removed? Because of course it should be removed and restored. There's nothing else we should definitely do. The other question is, after the contaminants are removed, are we talking years or decades before the fish become edible in the river?
Thanks. So about the tidal impacts, that's a very good point to bring up. So yes, the tide reaches below the dam, but not directly below the dam. So it's still a little bit further away. And so removing the dam at this point in time, I don't think we would see the tide come up much, like come up above where the dam is or where it currently is now. But obviously with future sea level rise, you would expect to see the tide come up over time.
What was the other question?
How long? I don't know.
So, it's a good question and really is more about, the Superfund site upstream, if we're going to call it that, which we can't yet because it's not. The site upstream that needs to be remediated really needs to be the source of that question, because we're not doing a contamination removal. We will take care of the stuff that we have to for our project. And our goal is to be able to eat the fish again in this river. So, I think it's really more of a problem from the upstream. So that's where we need to fix that problem. But there might be more different kinds of fish that you could take advantage of fishing for. So Becky's moderating here. Give it to, don't wrap it around. There you go. Go ahead, Doctor.
Good evening, folks. I'm Dr. Iacobucci from Pembroke. Been a member of North and South River Water Association for years. I'm an ardent appreciator of nature and the splendor that she has gifted us with. That's why I have invested in owning a 73-acre nature park in Pembroke. You can take a tour of it on our website. I urge you to do so for two reasons. The website is my phone number, 781-826-8888.com. Go there. You'll see pictures of the 12 habitats on our private nature preserve, the 2 miles of mowed trails, the multiple viewing benches. You'll see the pond, the meadows, all of which have to be maintained, the swamps, the tidal estuary, etc. I'm an amateur. I hired a professional. I said, tell us what this is all about. He evaluated it and concluded it had 12 habitats, which is unheard of on a small 73-acre parcel, which means when you come and enjoy the nature preserve, you'll see a plethora of plants and animals that you will not see anywhere else in such a short time. He listed the flora and the fauna on our website. It took 12 pages to list all the critters that live there. Now, having observed my pond, my streams, my river for 45 years, I can tell you this. Each habitat is the home of different collection of flora and fauna. When you eliminate a pond, you're eliminating a huge reservoir of animals I, as an amateur, see fish, ducks, blue heron, white egret, muskrats, all kinds of fish, turtles up the yin-yang, snappers 2 feet in diameter. Are these streams that they're going to create in place of the pond going to have that breadth and depth of habitat for flora and fauna?
Yes, they will. We see them all downriver too.
You have snappers downriver? Okay, I'm learning something new. But my observation is we don't have snappers and turtles in our creeks or rivers. We only have them in the pond. The pond is its own habitat. It sponsors its own wildlife. And again, don't take my word for it. Go to our website, see the professional evaluation, the professional listing. Now, the second thing I wanted to point out, we're living in climate change. Droughts are going to get worse. My pond will retain its water during a drought condition to save the wildlife that live there. Without that pond, they would all die. A question for you folks, if you eliminate the pond and have nothing but a stream, and a severe drought comes along, and there is no more stream, then all that nice fish you were trying to save, they're gone. Thank you for listening. Again, 781-826-8888.com. Thank you.
I'm not sure if there was a question in that, but. Hello? Okay, you turned it off, I guess. Yeah, you can try something.
Yeah, so I did show a picture of one of the dam removal projects that we did in Taunton, Mass, and there was a lot of there was a lot of evidence of fish coming upstream that didn't come upstream before the project, and there are numbers that are recorded to show the amount of fish that came up just 1 year after those dams were removed. And you can find that information online. You know, a lot of watershed associations record migratory fish coming upstream. And so a lot of them, you know, prove with these kind of projects that they do work. They do allow fish populations to begin to restore. So they're really important for restoring migratory fish populations. Well, this isn't a natural pond, right? There are plenty of natural ponds in Massachusetts. There's a lot of them, actually. And this is not a one that is not natural and is at the risk of potentially failing, like completely, you know, wiping away because these dams aren't, you know, they're aging. And so what we're trying to propose is doing something that's proactive. Exactly. Yep. Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yep. So for those on Zoom, there was a comment about how the temperature increases when in the impoundment compared to the river. And when they stock fish in the Indian Head River near the tack factory, a lot of those fish die off because of those increased temperatures and anoxic conditions in the impoundment. And so removing the dam, you're creating a river that has increased velocities. It's shallower. And so the water doesn't heat up as fast. And that's important for climate change, which you brought up, sir. You know, we're seeing increased temperatures. And even though there might be more drought conditions, we designed the river to withhold water in those kind of conditions too, as much as possible. So we create often a low flow channel where it's a little bit deeper in the middle to still have water in it.
Thank you. Your Zoom listeners, thank you. We do have a few comments saying absolutely do this, but but then we do have some questions. Maybe again, Neil, you can answer this. For dam removal, what are the impacts to traffic and road work, specifically at State Street?
Right. So typically you will need to close the road, at least in part. Well, State Street is a good example, right? So, or maybe a different example, because the dam itself is near the bridge, but not part of it. So the road would likely be able to stay open for the duration of construction. There would be probably need to be some kind of traffic detail there for getting construction vehicles in and out of the staging and access areas, but the road itself should be able to stay open. And likewise, the same thing would be true down at Luddum's, because you're even further away. The dam removal is even further away from the road.
Thanks, Neil. I'm going to kind of put two questions together here. Both are about sediment contamination. One is asking about neighborhoods abutting Rocky Run, Indian Head, Tucker's Preserve, concerned about contamination in groundwater and soil post dam removal at State Street. And the other is asking about contaminated sediment behind Luddum's, or I guess behind both dams, and how do you give comfort to those who use the downstream waters that they will be safe?
Right. So I guess I think what I'm hearing there is the question is, if there's contamination upstream of the dams and it's allowed to move downstream of the dams, what do you have to say about that? And it's a valid question, right? And it's why there has not been a sediment management plan decided upon yet for either of these dam removals. So that decision will need to get made, informed by more detailed sediment sampling and input from the state government at a minimum, local governments as well, to decide what is best. And the way this generally works is that sediment that is allowed to passively release downstream needs to pass those regulatory standards and be of similar quality to, or similar or better quality to what's downstream, so that your receiving areas are not getting made significantly worse by your donating areas. So that's the assessment that still needs to be done here to figure that out. Yes. How deep in the sediment is it? The question was, how deep in the sediment are the contaminants? So all of our sampling was done from the top 2 feet, and the total sediment depths there were mostly what, Sandra?
Around like 4 to 5, I think.
Well, a lot of it was lower, but right in front of the dam, you might have had 5 or 6 feet, correct?
Yeah, the max was 4 to 5 feet, and then like closer to the dam, or yeah, max 4 to 5 feet.
So the max is 4 to 5 feet right in front of the dam, and it gets less. We haven't sampled the very deep sediments right in front of the dam. It's mostly the top, as I said, top 2 feet over the bulk of the area.
So we're gonna let our moderator moderate.
I'll take a gentleman in the back there if you want to come up to the microphone. I'll keep this up. Oh, you're going to come to this one.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. John Mahoney. I'm a Pembroke property owner, taxpayer, and I'm also a Plymouth property owner, taxpayer, resident, and Plymouth Select Board member. I'm in my 5th term. Probably around 1981, I grew up in Pembroke Center. I got on my bike. I went over to Luddum's Ford Dam, and I pulled some salmon out beneath the dam. The state was there taking eggs from the bodies of the salmon through nets, and I did manage to take one home. My mother cooked it up, and to your point, Sarah, I'm still here. Having said that, the preeminent expert, in my opinion, maybe Alex will disagree with me, and dam removals in the state of Massachusetts is David Gould. He is the department head for the Division of Marine and Environmental Affairs in Plymouth, and on Town Brook alone, and it goes from the Atlantic Ocean up to Billington Sea. It's only 1.7 miles, a straight shot. Since '02, he's removed 5 dams, and behind 4 of those dams, there was a pond, and they don't exist anymore. And at the beginning of the process, when the first one was proposed to come out, you had the vocal minority saying, what the hell are we doing? And as soon as it was done and they saw the finished product, those same people said, why didn't we do that years ago? So you want removal and restoration. It's lower property taxes. This isn't just an environmental thing. It's lower property taxes. You are safer as a community. You have less debt. You have more recreational opportunities. It's not just kayaking, it's improved fishing. It's everything. So if you look at that dam today, Luddum's, that's the before. I have 5 to 10 examples in Plymouth of the after. So the town of Plymouth is available to you. I've talked repeatedly with Samantha and Becky. Okay, our experts are available to you. And if I'm needed to go into any of these select board meetings, I will to advocate it. This should be a no-brainer. This is what you want to do, okay? In the fall of 20, I reached out to the Pembroke chair of the select board at the time was Dan Trabucco. He came down on a bitter Friday evening, and I had a state employee there, Halifax resident. And he looked at Dan and said, I got a bucket with $7 million in it. I want to give it to you. You have more money available today for these projects than there ever has been. If this thing, Luddum's, comes out to be about 5 million, you should be able to secure 4 to 4.5 million from other sources. The 2 communities Hanover should be splitting 300 to 700 grand between them. Walk away. This is a legacy project. You will not regret it.
Gentleman in the black. See if I can-
Thank you. Hi, folks. So I'm a Hanson resident. My name is Nick Donahue. I'm in support of the dam removal. My question is about the sediment removal. So I started looking at the water in Hanson a couple of years ago, and it turns out that, we test for a certain number of things, but of course the science tells us that we should be testing for so many more. Lead was known to be a problem 1,000 years ago. Regulations came in place in the 1950s. Mercury, right, 1970s. So, the science policy lags behind science. So my question is, and I would support the project. I think the sediment plan is questionable. I wonder about in the years to come, what we'll know about elements that you're not concerned about, or you're not testing. You guys are experts. I think you probably have these conversations all the time about what's not known. The Environmental Working Group, with support of EPA, put out a report this year, unfortunately suggested that there are no freshwater fish that are safe to eat anymore. That it's like if you eat a freshwater fish, it's like drinking forever chemicals in water for a month. So, whether that's alarmist or right or not. So my real question is, I'm very concerned about the approach made to sediment, excavation. So I don't live downriver. I've canoed the whole thing. I enjoy the North River. And I'm really wondering how confident you are about how a partial removal plan, given what we know and what we don't know about sediment, really predicts for the future of the waterway and the health of the water downstream for people who think it's a good idea to remove the dams, but may not have information about what kind of toxins are being transported. So I know it's hard to look in a crystal ball, but when I look at the water regulations, Hanson, we test about 18 things, and there's 60 on a list by environmental groups that say that we should really be looking at those. And I'm wondering what that list looks like for sediment, and I'm wondering what you're going to do about making sure that you're not transporting a nightmare for future generations downriver. So I'm very supportive of removing the dams and reclaiming the water, but that part of the presentation really struck me as being insufficient unless I don't understand, and I'm not an expert, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about that because it's very concerning, and I think people who live downstream ought to look into it because it could be a nightmare for future generations. So any response to that concern?
I can try. So that's a bit of a difficult philosophical question.
What you know, what you as an expert think about the efficiency of moving the sediment in a way that's going to be safe for people in years to come.
Yeah. So let me start with to try to be able to help answer a little bit before the part that I'm going to punt on. So you talked a little bit about water, right? So
As an example, I know you're not
right. But I think there may have been some concern about potential contaminants that are in the water, maybe partly derived from the sediment that they've picked up along the way. So that water, whatever its chemical properties or contamination are, is going over the dam right now, will continue. Okay. Right. So all of these dam removals that have ever been done get done. The sediment gets managed per the regulations that are in place at the time. That's a very expansive suite. I mentioned that we sampled for something like a couple of hundred compounds here. There are certainly lots of other potential contaminants in the world. We sampled for everything that our due diligence assessment indicated was a reasonable concern to look for. It's not really practical to do what you're suggesting, to just, as I mentioned, the cost were close to $2,000 per sample for as we did. If you were to just go, and there aren't even tests for some of the there are this is why I'm getting philosophical that you talked about, right? Our society uses chemicals that there are not standards for regularly, and there aren't tests for. That's just a fact, right or wrong. Right.
So that you're not risking disbursement of a significant amount of sediment downriver for the reasons you are actually reinforcing right now.
Well, clearly, if you're concerned about contamination, full removal is the best option. It's also the most expensive. So that is certainly on the board to be discussed here. I will say that based on the results that we have to date, the data would not indicate that this is nearly contaminated enough to warrant that level of removal and cost. But it's, certainly on the board.
Yeah, and I just wanted to reiterate that we focused on lead and mercury because those are what showed up as above those exceedance values, but we tested for a lot of a lot of contaminants, and a lot of them showed up as non-detect, which is really good. And then I'll also add that in our designs for Luddum's Ford, we're suggesting, we're proposing more sediment sampling, but also removing the extent of the sediment that's in the active stream channel. So removing all the sediment down to what was originally there, like you hit kind of like a hard gravel, it's like the pre-dam channel. So removing all that fine sediment that's accumulated behind the dam and stabilizing the banks with, fabric, and often you put clean fill over that and vegetation to stabilize those banks. And that's a really common practice. And we've done it in other sites where we know that that sediment isn't as contaminated. So we'd be removing, and this is what we're suggesting, but it's not set in stone. We're going to be doing more sediment sampling, but we're advising to remove the what we think will mobilize downstream behind Luddum's Ford Dam. Okay. Yes, exactly. So actively excavating the channel that we're proposing down to the pre-dam channel. Yeah. That's okay. Sure. And I'm happy to talk to you more after as well.
Sure. I'm going to try to lump a few together here to get everybody's questions in. Someone asked a question about the town process for doing this. Given the scale of it, it seems like it would require a town meeting. Is that the case? Can you talk more about the process going forward, what the timeline looks like? And I think maybe relevant to that also is, do you have any numbers for the cost of the two examples that you gave, Sandra?
Sorry, I don't have those offhand, but I'm happy to provide them. And Sam and Becky will share my email with folks if you have questions about those dam removals specifically.
What's the question? Did you have the town approval process answered?
No.
Okay, so there was a town approval process question that was asked.
Sure. I was just going to see if John could provide color in terms of other costs.
Sure. Oh, because he's got other dam removals. Yeah, sure.
And if you don't, that's fine too.
The only thing I can say about Luddum's is that, again, when I did the site visit to the Newfield Street dam removal in Plymouth, and I was showing the chair of the Pembroke Select Board at the time the finished product, I had the state employee there, Bill Hinckley. Is he DER? Oh, that was you? And you live in Halifax. You got a beard now, right? Okay, all right, Bill, all right. So I'm going to tell you what Bill told me, and hopefully this is correct, right? It's what I just said a few minutes ago. You gave a ballpark of, like, if it was a $5 million project, give or take, in a perfect world, the two towns would split roughly 4 to 6 million, 4 to 600,000, and then 4 to 4.5 million would come from other sources.
In a typical situation, the local, whether it's a state grant or a federal grant, the local, it may be different in this scenario, but typically this local community is going to be responsible for 20 to 30% of coming up with the 20-30% of the cost. Now, how they come up with that can come from other places.
Correct.
Right. And so,
And you know, in Plymouth, obviously, David Gould is probably the best at doing that.
so it can come from within the town, it can come from federal sources, it can come from philanthropic sources. It doesn't really matter where it comes.
And I was correct, right? You still have the $7 million bucket?
So we have some there is some funding available.
Okay, there you go. All right, my God, you got to tell me, Bill, if you're here.
That's so funny.
When I was saying that earlier, did that ring a bell? Okay.
Yes, yes. So in terms of timeline and town approval, so our next step, as I mentioned, is for me to go before the select boards and to get a letter of commitment from the select boards, which we've received in the past, letters of support for funding. We've applied for funding through the Natural Resource Damages Fund. So that would be what comes next. It wouldn't be town meeting yet, but eventually, yes, this would go, I would imagine, would go before town meeting to approve whatever funding would be set aside for these dam removal projects. Timeline, unclear. State Street, potentially could move faster and could happen while we're waiting for the Luddum's Ford sampling to come through and the Superfund designation. But so the timeline is very much unclear at this point. But everything would be predicated on that commitment from the select board. Go ahead. Or wait, actually, we can lose.
Two questions. Will the slideshow be on your website? Thank you. And is the large wood installation just during construction, or is that a permanent thing?
So that would be a permanent feature. That's part of the design. As long, it obviously would decay over time, but at a much slower rate than you would expect. And it's to provide initial stability to those banks. And like I said, extra fish habitat. It provides cover right after construction because, there's not as much vegetation right after construction. And so we typically kind of will build a deeper pool in those areas and make some cooler covered water for the fish. This is the 40% design, so we're still early on. And so, large wood may work here, but it's part of the design process and might change in the future as well.
I was just going to actually get this. No, but that's okay. You're up.
Just one quick question. This area is covered by the St. North River Water protective order. How do you propose doing something that appears to be in violation of that order?
So I know that you can't build a dam on the North River as a result of the protective order. I'm not sure that you can't remove a dam.
You can't change any of the physical features.
Well, we're going to go through the process and we'll see. I'm not sure that that's how I would read the protective order. So I guess we're going to go find out because we have to go get a permit. Yeah, I think you're jumping way ahead. I haven't reviewed it. I will, and we can talk about it. But again, explicitly, the Scenic Protective Order says you can't build a dam. I'm pretty sure that you can restore the river. So I think we're going to have to review the contents of the regulations before we are sure about it. But it's a good question.
Oh, is this on? I'm a resident of Hanson, and I received notification about this meeting in the mail to my post office box. I contacted a number of people in Hanson that I know. They didn't receive any notification of this meeting. Did it go to everyone in Hanson?
So the town clerk pulled a list of all households in Hanson, Pembroke, and Hanover, and we mailed those postcard mailers to 16,000 households across those three towns, all of which the lists were provided by the towns.
Okay.
It was actually a state list that the towns requested from the state.
All right. So I found a lot of people that didn't have it. So I was just curious,
Okay.
Because I was hoping maybe you were going to do this meeting again, so more people would be aware of it. I don't know if it was the timing over Thanksgiving. It
Yeah.
came, right after Thanksgiving, then the notification or during that week.
Yeah, that certainly could be it. I would say this will be posted online. Everybody who's signed up either for this piece or for Zoom will get a link to it. I would encourage you to share it with people. I will be going before the Hanson Select Board at some point in early 2024. People can come to that meeting as well. And should the towns decide to make this commitment to move forward to pursue restoration, there'll be multiple more meetings like this.
Okay. My other comment is that I also have, from some people I've spoken to, have a concern because for years now, you weren't allowed to naturally not eat any of the fish on the Hanson side because of the thing we're not supposed to talk about, the super. But I didn't get a clear idea that, I don't know, it doesn't make sense to me, I guess, that you would want fish going past State Street until that other issue has been fixed, or, what the remediation is going to take. It seems like it would be money not well spent to go further into Hanson because of that. And I think a couple people here have already mentioned about the fish. Would the fish then that get upstream, when they go back out to the ocean, would they be contaminated? I mean, it's just, for me, it's scary for the fish to go any further than they are now. Thank you.
Do you have a response to that last piece I've sent at the beginning?
I guess my first thought is we definitely want the contamination levels to go down in our river so that in the future we can eat the fish. But that is part of what has to happen up at Factory Pond because that's where the contamination source is. So we are also going to be advocating for that at the same time, separate project. But I think many of you heard that there will be a tri-town meeting about that on January 11th. So there's another opportunity for us to discuss how, as a community, we can advocate together to get that cleanup moving again and moving as fast as possible and get the resources that are needed to clean up this legacy that has prevented all of us in the public from using the public's natural resources. So we are a big proponent of getting that cleaned up to the levels that we need to. That being said, it's going to take some time because there's a legacy of that pollution, and it will take, even after they remove the sediments, it will take some time for this to clear out of the system, as they say. And so in the meantime, the concerns for the mercury in particular in the eating of fish, mercury is unfortunately, throughout the planet. It comes down in the atmosphere from burning of fossil fuels. So we have lots of mercury throughout many of our impoundments and in waterways already. So it's a challenge, let's put it that way. But I don't think it would prevent us from wanting to restore and fix another problem, which is a dam that's preventing fish and fish populations from being able to be resilient in a changing climate. So that's kind of my one way of answering it.
So I'm going to go to a couple of Zoom questions. I will say we're at 8:45. We don't have this room for much longer. So we'll do a couple more Zoom, try to get in another audience and another Zoom, and then.
I think we're good on Zoom.
Oh.
We're covering most of it.
Great. Any other questions in the room? Yes.
Why does the mass fishing game stock the river if one, the fish don't survive, and B, the fish that do survive are not about.
I can answer.
I would think the fish and game department would be hitting themselves wide open for a lawsuit. That some kid will catch a half dozen trout, come home and eat them and get sick. Why do they stock?
So the question was, why does the Fish and Wildlife from the state stock the river? They largely use brown trout, right? It's a put and take. Brown and yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 So these are
above, above, up at the tack factory, I worked with those gentlemen one day, and I said, you guys are wasting your time and money putting those fish there. There's no oxygen there. So we took those fish and we put them above at the State Street Bridge, because that supports, there's a lot of moving water there and a tremendous amount of oxygen, even in the summertime. Until all those dams are down, all the way up to Factory Pond, and you get good current, I don't see that water temperature coming down a lot, and you need cold, fresh water.
And I think to your point about the contamination, these are hatchery fish, so they've been fed something else. They're only there for a few weeks.
I've had some experience. I shot all over the country. I go upstate New York. Lake Ontario is as clean as a whistle, but there's a lot of sediment on the bottom. The state of New York recommends you only eat one portion of salmon on a monthly basis, and that river's been clean for quite some time. And it's a wonderful fishery. I'll be up there this winter steelhead fishing. Oh, you have? Okay. But you don't eat the fish, do you?
All right.
Hello?
So, sorry.
Can somebody hear me?
Yep.
Okay, no, I'm Don Howard. I live across the street from Factory Pond. I've been there since 1948. My question is on State Street Dam. How far up did you go up the river towards Factory Pond on the testing of the sediment? Because of the fact that I know that they're cleaning up the industrial area in there where the fireworks was. And there's a lot of sediment in Factory Pond of mercury and lead. And I'm wondering if that's where where the lead's coming from down the river. And I was just curious how far you went up the river from State Street towards Factory Pond on the testing of the sediment.
Hi, yeah, thanks for your question. So we focused on the State Street Dam impoundment and didn't go up much further than that. And so that, you know, we didn't go up to Winter Street. We kind of focused around the dam itself and a little bit upstream, so not all the way up, because we're not really, you know, this project is not focused on Factory Pond, and so we were really looking solely at the State Street Cross Street impoundment.
Okay, I know that in 1993 Factory Pond Dam was rebuilt, and at the time it was done by P. Landers, I believe, which I worked for, and they put a solid concrete face on it and with riprap so that every time the water goes over the dam, it aerates it to try to clean up the water a little bit. So I just wanted to let that be known. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, I'm blind. I can't see.
Get it. Go ahead. It's for the Zoom.
I'm just curious about what the, in the watershed, when the dams are, you know, when the rivers are flowing, in the watershed, any of the other ponds that are affected, does it affect the hydrology of those ponds? Are they flowing faster? Does it make no difference whatsoever? Will we see some improvement in maybe some of the ponds and how the water's flowing? Is that anything that could make a difference for the height?
You're talking about disconnected ponds that are just in the watershed?
Yeah, so personally, selfishly, I'm talking about Indian Head Pond, and I think it's got Indian Head Brook going through it, which may be going into the Indian Head River. And I'm just kind of wondering, is that all going to start flowing better? And then I have a question, because we've got a wicked blue green algae thing going on. Is that going to affect what's happening in the river and move it through like an infection? So that's my question.
Yeah, so any disconnected ponds so the connection would just be groundwater, that connection is slow enough that there's going to be no perceivable increase in groundwater flow or movement from those ponds. Anything that has a direct surface connection, especially that that far up, I think is what you're talking about, is quite a bit further upstream. Like the changes that we're gonna see don't extend anywhere near that far upstream, so there should be no change in flow dynamics up there.
Yeah. So I could just add to that in that the Luddum's forward impoundment extends up to kind of where that old factory is. It's a steeper section, and so you don't really see the impacts of the dam beyond that. And then for State Street Dam, it's really just like above the impoundment because has already been breached. So we don't really see the impacts of that dam further up.
I think we need to look at the watershed a little bit more than just these dams. I think what's going on upstream is inextricably involved with what's going on downstream. And we didn't want to talk about it tonight, but it is going to be a Superfund site. And if it's going to be a Superfund site, how far can that site reach? Can it reach all the way to Luddum's Ford, which is polluted? And if so, would that sort of remove this particular project? Superfund is big money. I think in terms of environmental policy also, at least in Hanover, we need to look to the long term. The town is growing. The state is forcing us to plan for 750 more housing units. The water supply is a problem. I looked at the Hanover master plan, and on one of the maps, it shows an Indian Head reservoir. Also, from my history background, when the dam was in place at the Waterman Tack Factory, Project Dale was a huge impoundment behind there. And if you know your geology, you know that on either side of the river, there's a couple of 100-foot rise. So I think, at least in Hanover, I don't know who's doing the environmental policy, if anybody is, or if anyone is looking far ahead to water supply. So my thinking is, can we look into using the Superfund sites to really clean up Factory Pond, get all of the pollution out of there, make the river drink water quality, and build a reservoir along the river. Nobody's thinking about it, but if we're planning 20 years down the road, conservation is the wise use of our natural resources. The river is a natural resource. I understand it's nice to have herring and trout and so on, but human survival is also important. So I think that a little bit more study needs to go into the total picture, and I'm hoping that whoever is planning the Superfund will think about all these things. This is a great proposal. I've lived at Curtis Crossing for 45 years. I walk Tucker Preserve every day practically, and it would be nice. But we need to look at all aspects. I think this project was set out with a goal in mind, to remove the dam. And I think we need to have a goal to do what is best for the environment. Thank you.
I'll just respond in terms of the Superfund designation. I hate to make people feel like you weren't allowed to utter the word here today, but the point is that we just don't know the answers to those questions. Yeah, like we don't know what that boundary line is going to be. We don't know if it's going to reach down to Luddum's Ford. We don't know if the response. Well, yeah, I mean, hopefully we'll start to learn more, right? So it's a lot that's unknown. And I will say, and I know you can speak to this as well, in terms of this area as being a future drinking water supply, there is a remediation action plan in place for Factory Pond. Now, I don't know how that will change and be adjusted as part of the Superfund process. Right now, the remediation action plan is for the fish to be able to eat the fish that you catch. So there's just so much that's unknown, and hopefully there will be some open hearings and opportunities for people to share thoughts on the direction of that program, but we just don't know that yet.
I know, Neil, do you want to comment on making a surface water supply in the state of Massachusetts? Particularly one that had contaminated.
Yeah, and with all due respect, the chances of a surface water, drinking water reservoir being built on this river in our lifetimes, our children's lifetimes, or their children's lifetimes are essentially zero. Opinion, informed opinion.
Yeah, it's just very hard to permit such a thing because of the environmental rules around the building. It's not impossible. Nothing's impossible.
Big bucks.
Yeah. So anyways, I do think that as it stands, the dam is, and the water supply behind it is not a water, it could not be made into a drinking water supply easily. How's that?
Sank 2 wells in there. It's very, very close to, Factory Pond. And what impact does a pond like that have on the aquifer and the leaching out? I've seen things from Otis Air Force Base where that water has been contaminated all the way down to Woods Hole.
Yeah. So I think Neil would be a really good person to answer this too, and maybe repeat the question for the Zoom audience.
Yeah. So I think the question was, is it what is the effect that the contamination in the pond has on adjacent groundwater? Yeah. Right. So in general, in New England, most rivers are called groundwater discharge areas. So the groundwater flows from the surrounding area into the river and then discharges through the river downstream. Dams tend to locally reverse that trend. So the dam backs up the river high enough that you have localized flow from the impoundment out into the groundwater adjacent to it. But that influence is pretty short. I mean, we're talking like 100 feet maybe, and then before it then comes back into the river downstream of the dam and then continues along its way until it hits the next dam, and then that same pattern happens again. Obviously, extraction wells draw down the groundwater level, and if they're pumping hard enough and in the right conditions, can actually reverse the flow. If a new drinking water well was proposed near Factory Pond, as you're saying, they would have had to assess that as part of the permitting, and that if that was going on, that wouldn't have been allowed to go through.
I want to just take one more, gentlemen. I think that will do it for tonight. Absolutely.
I'm a Hanover resident, and just quickly, thank you for using Luddens instead of Luddum for the name of the ford. The 3 historical commissions have been convinced that the name has been wrong all these years, that there was no Luddum living at the time that the young man carried Governor Winthrop across the river, and in fact, there was a Ludden. So the name probably really should be Luddon, so thank you for that. That's not my question. My question is, I walk on both sides of the river between Luddon's Ford and State Street, and I notice seems like from season to season, there's a lot of variability in the water in that river, sometimes extremely low. And it looked like the examples that you showed us were very fulsome rivers. So I'm curious if there might be times when there would be just no water if both dams are removed, or can you figure that out? Or because that would have some effect on how what it looks like for one thing, but maybe how people even feel about it. Thanks.
Yeah, and apologies for not showing those low flow conditions. We did look at the seasonal flows during fish migration and low flow scenarios. we didn't look at drought conditions because we're kind of more looking at when water is in the river. But you know, we did look at depths and velocities during low flow conditions in our designs, and making sure that those are, you know, that those velocities and depths are possible for the target fish species that we were looking at.
So there is an Indian Head River gauge, stream gauge, right downstream of Elm Street that's been there since 1967, and we've never seen it go dry. So you won't see it go dry as a result of dam removal, okay? If we see it go dry, it's because we've entered into some new climate chapter that we haven't seen yet. Now, is it possible? Anything's possible, but we haven't seen it in the historic record. And I will say that when the summertime droughts of 2016, 2020, and the last one we just had occurred, the downstream areas beneath a dam are dewatered, right? So you may retain water in the pond, very hot water, by the way, stagnant water that's losing oxygen. Downstream is completely dewatered and only is gaining from any cracks from the dam or from groundwater, as Neil said, that's recharging, because these are essentially what you are seeing in the summertime when it's not raining. The water in the river is groundwater at the surface. So, so the dams actually can cause a river to be dewatered if you don't have what's called a stream flow release plan, which we don't have here. So, yeah. Dewatered means dry.
I'm going to also point out from a water budget perspective, you know, the total amount of water available, the ponds behind the dam increase the evaporation compared to what a natural river would be. So there's a net loss of water to the atmosphere in a dam state as compared to an undammed state.
Yeah, I think one of the things we think about is this: it's the same amount of water coming in as going out. We're not changing the flow of the water. There will still be, will be whatever the river is going to be because of precipitation and because of groundwater levels. The dam doesn't really have that control.
All right, well, great. Again, thank you all for coming. Thank you for attending via Zoom. Lots of great questions, lots of great conversation. There certainly isn't the end of it, so you'll be hearing from us with a link to the materials. As I said, please keep an eye on those select board calendars for when this conversation continues. Thanks.